Alright, hi everybody, and welcome back to another video. I'm Steve, or Blinkcoom, and today I want to go over my 2018 Game of the Year runner-ups, or honorable mentions, or kind of best of the rest. So I mentioned a little bit when I was making the top 10 of the year that after considering it for a while, it was actually pretty difficult for me to put together a top 10 list, even though I thought going into the year that it would be pretty easy. And that's because when I really sat down and looked at like all the releases that came out, I noticed that there was actually a lot of really good stuff, and a lot of it for me kind of hovered in that like 6 to 10 range. But after whittling it down and getting my list put together, I thought, it would be kind of a disservice to not at least speak a little bit to these games that maybe had some element that kept me from loving them just enough to put them on the top 10, or maybe I didn't play quite enough of them as I would have liked to give them like a truly fair assessment. Or in some cases, I honestly just played them a little bit too late for them to make the cutoff. So, well, today we'll just kind of go over a handful of games here and talk about what's good about them and give you the opportunity to hear a little about them, and hopefully you can check them out. So, everything that is on this list here, for one reason or another, I still think is a great game, and I still think is worth looking at. I just think is not something that quite made it into my top 10 range. So I think what we'll do first is I will cover a handful of games, and these were the ones that were really competing for the number 10 spot on the list. And the first one of those is Onrush. So this one actually took me by surprise. I first played Onrush when it came to PS Plus in November, I think. October, November, maybe even December. I'm not entirely sure, but it was a free PS Plus game, and I at the time happened to have my PS Plus membership active. And even on top of that, it's pretty rare for me to randomly download those free games and check them out, because I have so many other games that I want to get to that checking out a random game that wasn't really on my radar before then isn't always kind of in line with what I want to play. So for whatever reason, I downloaded Onrush and I decided to check it out. I think I had heard a little bit about it from other sources about how it was an interesting kind of spin on the racing car combat genre. And man, that is spot on. So in this game, you are playing as a racer, but your objective is not to come in first place. In fact, the place is irrelevant in this racing game. So one example of how this game plays is you might have an objective that says go through as many gates as possible to build time for your team, and whichever team goes through the most gates before the time runs out wins. So you aren't really concerned about being in first or being in last. You're just trying to make sure that you're driving around getting into those timed gates, but other folks are trying to knock you out of the way. You can knock other folks out of the way, and you're trying to be sort of combative in meeting the objectives while taking out the other team. On top of that, all the cars are kind of like heroes from a MOBA game where they have their own individual skill sets. They'll have active and passive abilities. So one car might let out a huge smoke trail behind it when you activate its kind of super move. Another car might, when you go off of jumps, kind of magnetically target other cars on the ground for you to land on top of and destroy them. In general, it just makes the experience unlike any other driving experience I've had in the year. So if you're interested in kind of a new spin on a racing game that's sort of fun and arcadey and a great multiplayer experience, definitely check out Onrush. All right, next is probably the game that I've spent the most time with that didn't make it onto my top 10, and this one was really close. When I was sitting down trying to decide whether or not I was going to put this or one other game on, this was just barely edged out, and that is Dead Cells. So Dead Cells is essentially a modern take on an action roguelike. The levels are all randomly generated, but they do the specific areas you'll go to might go into a specific order. They're all laid out like Metroid-style maps with different paths to find and explore, and upgrades to get and stuff like that. And then every run you go on, you will find new weapons or new abilities, or you'll find opportunities to increase different stats, and those different stats might increase your HP or your strength with certain types of weapons, stuff like that. And then in addition to that, you'll also find blueprints for new rare weapons or new types of weapons or new abilities that you can bring into your next run. So you're trying to get as far through this world as you can on each individual run, and as you kill enemies, you'll pick up dead cells from them, which is kind of the ongoing currency in the game. So in between every kind of mini map, you'll bring your cells back and you'll fill up upgrade slots, or you'll fill up unlocking those weapons that you found blueprints for, or unlocking new mutations, which are kind of like passive abilities that you have on each individual run. And what I really love about this game is that it clicks. Like, when you're playing this game, it feels so good in your hands. The dodge roll is maybe the best dodge roll in any game. The double jump is, like, at first, honestly, it felt a little weak, like it was a little short, but after you get used to using it and dodge rolling in the middle of double jumps and smashing through doors to stun enemies and stuff like that, it feels really fluid, and it always feels like it's responding to your commands perfectly. The difficulty is really well tuned, where every time you get 20-30 minutes into a run and die, at least for me, I always feel like, okay, that was my mistake, I got impatient, I could have done a little bit better. And I never feel like the game threw something unfair or cheap at me just to take out my run. I still haven't made it all the way through. I still haven't completed a run, but I've gotten a couple of them that are really close, and I just keep finding myself going back to Dead Cells. Dead Cells is probably the best roguelike I've played in a few years. All right, so this one didn't make the list because honestly, it's because I hadn't played it at the time that I started putting the list together. I just got around to this one not too long ago, so I played it a little bit after 2018, and that is Overcooked 2. So I never played the first Overcooked, and this was my first experience with these games, or even kind of this style of game. But essentially, you and however many friends you played with, and I've played it with me and my girlfriend have played it together, and then me and my girlfriend and two of our friends have played it together. So I've played it 2 players and 4 players, and both work really well. Essentially, orders come up, you're working in this kitchen, and you'll see orders come up across the top of the screen. Someone wants a cheeseburger or a hamburger, or they want a burger with lettuce and tomato, or spaghetti, or whatever it might be. And you all need to run around and make that food and prepare it and serve it basically before that order ticket runs out. So it's kind of on a time limit. You'll have like a minute and a half or something to make this burger. But what's really fun about this game is that all of the individual pieces of what you need to do, so cooking the meat, or steaming rice, or chopping vegetables, or cleaning dishes, or whatever, someone needs to physically do. And so everyone kind of runs around chaotically trying to assign roles to themselves and get things done and work together, and you have to do a lot of communication to make sure you're being effective. So using the burger as an example, you might have to say, okay, hey guys, we need a cheeseburger, so I'll go chop the cheese. Can someone cook the meat? And it looks like we have some dishes. We need someone to clean dishes because we need a plate to serve this on. And you can throw ingredients between each other, and you can hand stuff off and things like that. And then on top of that, the kitchens are usually either set up really uniquely, where things that you need to do are kind of on opposite sides of the kitchen from each other. So you might pick up the vegetables on one side of the kitchen, but only be able to chop them on the other side of the kitchen. Or the kitchens will physically move around. So as an example, there was a kitchen that was basically 2 hot air balloons, and the air balloons would kind of drift around one another. And so the shape of your kitchen and what you have access to completely changes. And there are other kitchens just like that, where you're on rafts, or halfway through the level, the kitchen might get destroyed and end up looking completely different than when you started the level. There are levels where the kitchens have like magic portals and shifting staircases because they're in kind of like a magic school. It's just super unique, super interesting gameplay, and probably the best, not even probably, this is the best co-op game that I've played this year. It is so much fun to get friends together and just kind of let the panic ensue and see how well you guys can do. Yeah, I am all on board for more of these types of games. I wish I had missed the first one. I'll have to go back and pick it up, because Overcooked 2 was definitely kind of my multiplayer co-op-ish game of the year. All right, and finally is one that I'm sure a lot of folks played it didn't quite make it onto my top 10, sort of because it's a remake of an existing game, and actually that's going to be a theme for the next couple of games that I go through here, and that's Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu. So I gotta be honest, when I first heard about this game, I wasn't negative like everybody else. I actually do play Pokemon Go. And so when they said that the Pokemon Go mechanics were kind of going to be hooked into Pokemon Yellow in a remake, I was like, okay, I mean, Pokemon Go's catching mechanics are fine. But I was kind of hopeful that it would still be a little bit more fleshed out than Pokemon Go was, just because it was a good opportunity to go back and visit that world, and I would have liked to sink my teeth in. And I mean, I was right on. I feel like this game is being sold as like a super casual, only for Pokemon Go players. Fans of the original games will have nothing to see here. And I don't think that that's true at all. I mean, yes, the catching mechanic has been replaced with the Pokemon Go, where you just throw a Pokeball rather than battling to catch the Pokemon. But other than that, I mean, the actual gym battles are all very much the same. Your Pokemon still level up and learn moves in a very similar way. All the type advantages are still there. So all of the battling aspects of this game are exactly the way that they were in the original Red, Blue, Yellow. So the only thing that's really different is that rather than battle to catch Pokemon, you throw Pokeballs to catch Pokemon. So to me, it feels like taking the best parts of the old game and streamlining the most repetitious parts. And then when you tack on that the catching gives you a decent amount of experience for all your Pokemon, you don't need to do a lot of grinding, and that you can see the Pokemon on the overworld map. To me, it just feels like maybe a better version of those original games. I mean, if I was going to go back and play Red, Blue, and Yellow, I think I might instead go back and play this game. Or if I did decide to go back and play those old ones, it's because I would be specifically looking for that very traditional style RPG gameplay. But this is not this is no slouch. This is not a game to sleep on. This is not super casual mode like some people have been saying it is. This is definitely essentially another Pokemon game, like a main. It feels like it could be a mainline Pokemon game. On top of that, I mean, it's impossible not to just feel nostalgic and just feel good about going back and revisiting that world that was like such a big part of me growing up and my childhood, and sort of reliving my first RPG that I ever got really into. Playing through this was a really good opportunity for me to use some Pokemon and use a team that I had never really used before in the original games. So I didn't use the traditional the starters or some of the stronger Pokemon that you might typically think of, like Alakazam and Gengar and stuff like that. I used some weirder ones. And I was still able to get through the game just fine, and it gave it a good level of difficulty. Not too easy, but not too hard. So if you were on the fence about this game because you thought it was going to be too casual, it was going to be just a clone of Pokemon Go, that's definitely not the case. Check out Pokemon Let's Go. And it's hard not to have a great time with it. It's basically the comfiest game of 2018. Alright, so just like Pokemon Let's Go, these next couple of games are remakes or remastered versions of games that have already been released in the past. And so I wasn't really sure how to handle them on my list, and decided, you know what, I'll just kind of set these to the side and talk about them in the runner-up Best of the Rest video. And the first one of those is Spyro the Reignited Trilogy. So this is all three of the PlayStation 1 Spyro games completely remastered. So these look incredible. Honestly, this is maybe one of the better looking games that came out this year. And beyond that, they just play exactly like the original PlayStation 1 games. So Spyro was a huge franchise for me growing up. I loved and still love the collectathon platformer style gameplay. And I always connected a little more with Spyro than I did with Crash Bandicoot in the PlayStation 1 era. So it was just like an absolute treat to go back, replay all three of these games. I think they control great. They've updated the visuals, but it still feels true to what sort of you imagine them in your mind. And this is kind of true of a lot of these remakes, but essentially they've taken how you remember the game and made the game look like that now. So you're essentially getting to play the version in your head without all the blemishes that the original version actually had. If you're a big trophy person, these are great because all three of the Platinum trophies are relatively easy to get. Basically, there's one unique objective you need to do in every world in each game. And they add a little bit more variety to the levels on top of what you're already collecting, so I think that they're actually implemented pretty well. And yet, just in general, I mean, there's not a ton you can say about it because it is those original Spyro games, But if you've never played them before, oh man, you have to try out Spyro. And if you have played them before, but you're even a little bit itching to go back and try them out again, definitely pick up the collection. All right, the last of the sort of remake remasters here is a game that I had never played before this release, but I was happy I picked it up, and that's Yakuza Kiwami 2. My experience with the Yakuza series has been pretty light. I'd actually never played a Yakuza game until the first Yakuza Kiwami. After Yakuza 0 came out, and sort of everyone started falling in love with the series, and it really kind of gained that popularity that it has now. I felt enough pressure to finally check one of these games out. I'd been interested in them for a long time. Honestly, I've been interested in them ever since about Yakuza 3. I just, for whatever reason, never got around to finding the time to play them. But after I played the first Yakuza Kiwami, I immediately was hooked on this series. I think that Kiryu is probably the best protagonist in any game ever, certainly in any like third-person action game. And these games have so much style and so much charm that it's hard not to fall in love with them. So I played this one immediately after the first Yakuza Kiwami, and I think that they do a good job of kind of continuing what that first game laid out and did to improve upon the originals. This one has upgraded to a new engine. I think it's called the Dragon Engine or something to that effect. But it looks a lot nicer. The combat system compared to the first Kiwami is a little bit more physics-based and a little bit more slow-paced. And the story in this one feels a little bit more mature, a little bit more fleshed out, and does a good job to expand on some of the characters from the first one and introduce some new ones too. So if you were a fan of the first Kiwami, if you're a fan of any of the other Yakuza games, I mean, you know what you're going to expect here. But if you haven't played a Yakuza game at all, this might not be the one to come in on. I would say either Kiwami 1 or I Hear 0 are the two to kind of enter into the series on. But after you play the first Kiwami, don't sleep on this one. Definitely check out Kiwami 2 because it has everything that those other games have. It's just a continuation of the story from where it already picked up. Tons of awesome, silly, goofy mini games, great writing, fun side quests, a good mix of silly stuff and serious stuff, and some heartwarming stuff. Yeah, the Yakuza games kind of hit the whole emotional spectrum, and I think that these games like are finally getting the appreciation they deserve. Certainly from me, but I think from the general audience too. So definitely check out Yakuza Kiwami 2. All right, so I have a handful of other games to show you, and then some other games that I can't show you, but that I wanted to talk about. The first one of those is a PSVR game that I played for the first time this year. Well, it came out for the first time this year, and that is Déraciné. So this is the latest game from Software, but it's nothing like Dark Souls. It's nothing like Bloodborne. Essentially, this is what most people at this point are calling walking simulators, but I don't mean that in any kind of derogatory way. Essentially, it is a narrative-driven kind of sandbox storytelling game where you are playing as like this fairy or this ghost inside this orphanage where these different kids live. And as you walk around and explore this facility, you'll find kind of images or shadows of the kids that represent a moment in their life. And so you'll click on that and you'll hear a little bit about what the kids were talking about or what the kids were saying at that point in time. It'll reveal a little bit of dialogue and a little bit of the story. Then you'll walk around and keep trying to find the other kids to kind of understand what everybody's trajectory was, what everybody's path was in this orphanage. On top of that, there are a small handful of puzzles that involve you sort of extracting the life out of an object and then imbuing it into another similar or similarly sized object. So like one of the earliest examples is there's a bowl of grapes and a wilted flower that a girl is holding. You kind of extract the life force out of these grapes. They kind of shrivel up and die because you've sucked their energy out. And then you can imbue that into the flower. The flower goes from wilted back to kind of blooming and full of life again. And then the kid who's holding it is happy. A little bit hard to describe because on top of that, there's also like some leaps through time, so you can see events from different days. And the story itself starts taking an interesting twist about 2/3 of the way through. Honestly, it gets a little bit. Well, I don't want to spoil anything, but let's just say that it goes in some pretty interesting directions and doesn't quite end where I expected it to. It's a short game. It's a good slow-paced VR game if you want something kind of relaxed. It's going to take you 4 or 5 hours to get through. There are a small handful of collectibles you can look for and stuff like that. But I think the one thing to sell on this game is it just has an excellent sense of place. The voice acting seems good. It's a beautiful looking game, and it's just an interesting environment and world to explore. So I don't know if a lot of people have picked this one up or really talked about it too much, but I would definitely check out Durasane if you're certainly if you have a PlayStation VR. This is one to check out when it gets cheap enough. But if you don't have a PlayStation VR, keep it in mind for some of the games you might want to check out, either if when you eventually do get one or when you have the opportunity to play on a friend's PlayStation VR, because I think this game is sort of could become sort of a sleeper hit on the system. It's really fun. All right, a quick mention here for one game that honestly is not amazing, but it's really easy to have dumb fun with it, and that is A Way Out. This is the next game from the studio that brought you Brothers, Tale of Two Sons. I loved Brothers. It was one of my absolute favorite games that year, and it's one of my favorite indie games that I've ever played. And A Way Out keeps the tradition of Brothers in that it does interesting cooperative. It plays with cooperative mechanics in an interesting way. Where Brothers had you controlling two brothers with two different sticks, A Way Out is about you and a friend playing a co-op game that is explicitly designed for co-op and can't be experienced outside of co-op. No matter what you're playing, either couch co-op or if you're playing online with a friend, the game is always split screen. And that split screen might move between horizontal and vertical, or one screen might expand or shrink depending on how important what that particular character is doing. But it's always split screen, which means that the game can kind of play around with that perspective and use it to enhance or focus on certain events or certain things. And it kind of drives forward that sense of cooperative play. So you and a friend are ultimately trying to escape a prison, and then some other events unfold where you end up doing a bunch of other crazy kind of Uncharted-y type stuff. The story falls a little flat. The characters, I think they want them to be more likable than they are, but it's very rare that a true co-op game is released, especially these days. And if you have a friend that you can just kind of joke around with and mess around with, you're going to have fun with this game because there are some really well executed sequences. There's some really well thought out kind of asymmetrical co-op stuff going on where one person is doing something completely different from somebody else, or one person gets themselves into a sticky situation that the other person has to help them get out of. But the story isn't quite going to land with most folks, I don't think. It does an interesting thing at the end, but you can kind of see it coming. Yeah, and I don't want to say that this game is terrible, because this isn't like an absolutely terrible game. It's a fun game with a story that just doesn't quite land with you. But if you're looking for a co-op time, I do think you'll have fun if you check out A Way Out. All right, two more, and these are both Switch games. The first one is one of the better RPGs that came out this year. That is Octopath Traveler. So I think by now most have probably checked this game out, but if you haven't, it is very much in the style of like a PS1 era role-playing game. I think a lot of people compare it to a Super Nintendo role-playing game, but I don't think that that's actually quite on the mark. It looks more like Lunar or one of those kind of early, maybe Xenogears PS1 RPGs with 2D sprites and some 2D animation, but on a 3D world. Because all of the characters and sprites in this game are 2D on top of these kind of dramatically lit diorama scenes that are three-dimensional. But this game really shines in a couple of areas and then falls just a little bit short in one, too. The best part about this game, and I think the thing that most people are really going to love, is the combat system. So your characters can kind of build up these points as they fight that they can then utilize to take multiple turns at once. And enemies have these. So I think the thing that most people are really going to connect with on this game is the combat system. It's got a couple of interesting things going on that make it unique compared to other role-playing games. The first is that your characters have these points. I forget what they're called, but you can build up to a handful of points that lets you use them in order to take multiple actions in a given turn, up to 4 actions in a turn, I believe. So you can save them up, and then you can attack 4 times in a turn if you want to. And then the other element is that enemies have these kind of break points where they'll have, say, 8 break points that go down by 1 every time you use something that they're weak to. So enemies are weak to different elemental magic types or different weapon types. And so you want to kind of build it up so you're using the weapons or the magic types that they're weak to, and then strategically breaking them, which will stun them for a turn and let you do a bunch of extra damage when you're attacking them. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a puzzle game in trying to time when you cash in your actions, when you're going all in to try to break an enemy, or when do you try to strategically wait just one more turn and then break them before they're about to do some super attack, something like that. And the combat system is definitely the thing about this game that people that keeps people coming back to it. On top of that, it has a really great soundtrack. Obviously, the visual style is striking and is effective throughout the entire game. It's got a lot of really great elements, but the one thing that it doesn't do really well is it ends up being pretty repetitive. You'll walk around, you'll learn some information. You usually have to do what they call your path action to help you figure out where to go. So one character's path action might be to steal from characters, another one might be to challenge them to a duel, stuff like that. You'll do your path action, you'll figure out where the dungeon is that you need to go to. You go to the dungeon, you fight the boss, the chapter ends. So, I mean, I'm aware that most RPGs follow that formula, but they at least try to mask it in a longer contiguous story, and the repetition in other RPGs is a little bit easier to stomach because the characters go back and forth and build relationships and stuff like that. They don't do that in this game. To be fair, I did only get through about chapter 2 with every character. I didn't complete this game, so I have heard a little bit that they start to build a little bit more of a relationship with one another as you get further in the game, but I just never got far enough to see that stuff, and I played it for a decent amount of time. So, I mean, in the end, if you're a fan of role-playing games, this is absolutely a game worth checking out. This is an awesome RPG and a great entry point for this new series. I'm very much on board for another Octopath game. It's just, I think some folks might bounce off of it a little bit early because of that repetition. But if that doesn't sound like it bothers you too much, or if you're fine maybe not getting all the way through it, Octopath Traveler is one of the RPGs that you shouldn't miss out on. Definitely one of the better Switch exclusives. All right, and then the last game I have here to show you is Mega Man 11. Let's see if I can get that. There we go. Mega Man 11 is the game that needs no introduction, I think. I mean, at this point, everybody's played a Mega Man game, and I think we were all a little bit surprised when they did announce this. But without kind of belaboring points that you have heard about elsewhere, or that you might already be familiar with because you played other Mega Man games, essentially, yeah, this is another awesome Mega Man game, and in 2018, it's cool to get another good Mega Man game. The one new mechanic that they added in this is the gear system, which lets you either slow down time in order to avoid traps and dodge enemy projectiles, stuff like that, or double the strength of your buster for a little bit. And to be honest, I really only ever used the slowing down time one. It felt like even in combat situations, I could get more shots in if I slowed down time than if I used the double power one. I don't know if that's actually the best way to do it, but it kind of is the route that I ended up leaning on a little bit. But all the bosses are fun. It's got good levels. It's got a decent soundtrack. And really, it's nice to see another good Mega Man game. Um, I think that the difficulty on this one is a little bit inconsistent. To me, it felt like there were some levels that were really, really hard and some levels that I was able to breeze through. But maybe that's true of all Mega Man games, just depending on the order that you do things and stuff like that. The enemy weapons that you get are fun. There's a lot of unique, diverse weapon types. They're not just all like variations on an elemental Buster Shot, which is cool. And yeah, I mean, it's more Mega Man. Mega Man's awesome, and this is awesome. So if you're a fan of this series, or if you're looking for an action platformer game, definitely you could do worse. It's a good time. All right. So there are a handful of games that were digital only releases this year that I also really enjoyed. That I wanted to just give a little bit of a mention to as stuff that you definitely should take the time to check out and play. The first of those is The Messenger. So The Messenger is a action platformer on the Switch, sort of in the vein of like a Ninja Gaiden type game. And without spoiling anything in this game, it ends up being much more than that. So I think by now a lot of people have heard about sort of the mechanics of this game, but in the event that you haven't, I don't want to give anything away too much. Just know that it starts out as a great kind of Ninja Gaiden style clone, and it turns into much, much more than that. I actually, to give you an idea of how it mixes things up a little bit, I think my final time in the game was about 10 or 11 hours, and I did everything that you can do in the game. But 10 or 11 hours is a pretty good amount of time to put into what at first blush appears to be a 2D action NES style game. So just know that it's definitely worth sticking through to see what happens. And if you're a fan of what you play at the beginning of the game, you're going to love the trajectory that the game takes. So The Messenger is definitely one of the best kind of indie releases this year. Great soundtrack too. If you're a fan of NES style chiptune music, Messenger is awesome. All right, the next game that I think people definitely should check out and probably hasn't gotten as much attention as I feel like it should is a game that I don't quite know how to pronounce. I want to say that it's Gris. It's either Grease or Gris, but I'm pretty sure it's Gris because that stands for gray. But what Gris is a puzzle platformer that more than anything is just really moody and affecting. The game is beautiful. All of the environments are sort of hand painted and animated in the style of these beautiful watercolor paintings. And as you play through the game, you're kind of restoring color to this world. So you'll go to different areas that will restore a particular color, and the areas will be loosely themed around what that color might entail. But more than that, kind of the emotion that color is supposed to inspire when you think about it. It's really hard to describe, but you get kind of new abilities as you would in a puzzle platformer that lets you solve different types of puzzles. So you get maybe the ability to break through blocks or swim in a new way, things like that. And as you explore this world and start restoring color to it, you start to reveal little bits about the story and understand a little bit about what's going on in this world. It ends up still being a pretty vague story. I think they're intentionally leaving it up to your interpretation. But all of the pieces come together to create something really memorable in Gris. Like I said, the game looks great. The sound design and the soundtrack are very kind of soft and have a lot of gentle like synth tones and things like that. And the animation is all kind of really smooth and charming. And it's just, I think once you see the game, you understand what the appeal of that game is. And then in motion, it just looks even better than that. So I would say if you're a fan of any kind of puzzle platformer, or if you're looking for a sort of artistic focused game that came out in 2018, definitely check out Gris. All right, so the next game that I don't want to spend a ton of time talking about because, sort of like Mega Man, this is just a really good version of an old game that already came out before. But that's Bloodstained Curse of the Moon. So, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon came out as a part of the Bloodstained Kickstarter, and I think it was a stretch goal to release this game ahead of the actual game Bloodstained. And if we're being honest, I think that this is going to probably end up being better than the actual full game that gets released, because this is just spot on for fans of Castlevania. So, Curse of the Moon is really just trying to be a spiritual successor to Castlevania 3. And honestly, I feel like this could just have been the sequel to Castlevania 3 if Castlevania 3 had gotten an explicit sequel. Just like in Castlevania 3, you have multiple characters that you can play as and switch between that you'll kind of meet and carry with you as you progress through the different stages of the game. And each of them have a little bit different play style, a little bit different set of abilities, things like that. And beyond that, I mean, this is just a really well done Castlevania game. The animation is gorgeous. It's got one of the better soundtracks to come out this year. Just like The Messenger, if you're into like NES style chiptune sort of soundtracks, this one fits right up there along with any of the classics of the original Nintendo era that you loved. And it's hard to say anything more intelligent than just, man, if you like Castlevania games or if you like action platformers, this one is not to be missed. It is definitely one of the best. The difficulty is a little bit easier than some of the older Castlevania games. I feel like it's not too hard to get all the way through and isn't too punishing. The bosses are like huge full screen bosses in a lot of cases that have some interesting attack patterns. And actually, one thing that's odd about the bosses that I felt like was a pretty weird design choice is that most of them have kind of like a last ditch attack. So after you defeat them, they'll all have kind of one last desperate attempt to take you down. So you gotta be ready for those. Otherwise, you might end up dying after you already thought you beat the boss. But yeah, just in general, this is a perfect example of what made those classic platforming games good and how you can modernize it while keeping the spirit of those old games. So, Bloodstained Curse of the Moon is one of those sort of retro platformers that elevates itself above the other games in that style and ends up being one of the best, basically one of the best 2D games released in 2018. All right, and then the last game that I wanted to just give a quick shout out to is Florence. Florence is a mobile game, and you can't talk much about the individual elements of the story without essentially just giving the entire thing away. But it's a really short experience. It probably only takes about an hour to complete. And all you're doing is going through the process of getting into and out of a relationship. You play as this girl Florence who meets someone, and you do various different kind of minigame style actions that introduce you to this new person in your life, take you through the different elements of getting to know them better, integrating your lives together, and then helping to understand how that can be difficult when those things separate again. And it does an excellent job using the mechanics of the game as a metaphor for the things that are happening. And what Florence really sticks out above any of the, well, not above, but what makes Florence stick out compared to the rest of the games that I've talked about is that Florence truly is just a small personal story that is only trying to be that. It's not trying to tell anything larger. It is just something that is relatable and is something that takes an event that basically everybody goes through in life and does a good job mapping that to game mechanics to make you feel and make you understand what that's like when you're in that situation. It isn't going to take you a lot of time, but it's something that I think sticks with you. And for only a couple of dollars, I mean, you really can't go wrong. So if you don't mind a game that is entirely textless, that is just told through game mechanics and still images and a little bit of animation, check out Florence, because it is my favorite mobile game that I played this year. And again, just refreshing to play something bite-sized, small in scope, and telling a personal story like that. All right, so there we have it. My list of honorable mentions, runner-ups, best of the rest type games that came out in 2018. Stuff that didn't quite make it onto the Game of the Year list, but I felt like it would be a shame not to give a little bit of spotlight to, give a little bit of attention to, and hopefully point some people towards. There was a lot of really good games that came out. Yeah, I hope that you discovered something fun. Thank you for sticking all the way through this video, and here's to 2019. Let's get excited for the releases that are about to come out. Thanks, everybody.